honestly, Eb, I don't know what AUKUS is all about. I know that it's going to deliver perhaps 3 old nuclear-powered submarines from the United States sometime, with the possibility sometime of getting 2 more. And that after we've got those, we will join with the British and sometime design an Australian-British nuclear-powered submarine, which we will build sometime and may sometime be delivered. Well, I just don't think it's good enough.
Sounds a bit vague, Alan.
Have one for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and it's been a big few weeks for international affairs in Australia. US President Joe Biden, who was due to visit Australia and Papua New Guinea, had to cancel his trip at the last minute thanks to some domestic politics. The scheduled Quad meeting that was due to happen in Australia instead happened on the sidelines of the G7 in Japan. And this week, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is visiting and received a huge welcome in Australia. And in the background to all of this, more and more questions are being raised about the nature and details of the AUKUS agreement.
And the big news coming in, the Quad summit in Australia has been cancelled.
US President Joe Biden has postponed his upcoming trip to Australia to deal with a looming fiscal crisis back home.
I'm cutting my trip short.
Quad leaders meeting will not be going ahead in Sydney next week.
Swapping Sydney Harbour for Hiroshima Bay.
G7 summit. Our PM, Anthony Albanese, chairing a meeting with Quad leaders from the United States, India and also Japan, and it was certainly productive too. Joe Biden signing a defence deal with Australia as the summit leaders head out of China.
AUKUS, that's the pact between Australia, the US and the UK, and it's designed to give nuclear submarine technology to Australia, but also to share technologies related to intelligence and artificial intelligence.
Biden confirming he will ask Congress to add Australia as a domestic source for arms manufacturing as part of the AUKUS agreement.
China is not a threat. Was not a threat, is not a threat, is not going to be a threat in the future to Australia.
So to unpack all this and more, I'm joined by Alan Beam, Director of the Australia Institute's International and Security Affairs Program. G'day, Alan.
G'day, Ebony.
So firstly, Alan, I want to start with the Quad. And I'm wondering if you can tell us exactly what it is and who's in it.
Well, I can tell you who's in it. Exactly what it is, I'm not yet quite sure. But it consists, obviously, of the United States, Japan, India and Australia. Now, what is interesting about the Quad is that each of those members lives on the edge of Asia. Japan doesn't see itself really as being an Asian country. India is such a huge country that it's really not an Asian country as we know it, though we paint it that way. Australia is not Asian and nor is the United States. So in a curious way, the 4 members of the Quad live on the margins of Asia. And that might lead one to think, well, if they live on the margins of Asia, then perhaps the Quad is itself marginal. And while I think that it probably does deliver a bit more utility to its members than marginality, it doesn't deliver a whole lot. And I think the reason for that is that the 4 countries get on pretty well anyway. It is not as though bilaterally they achieve anything less than they achieve multilaterally. And the focus of the Quad appears to be the effective containment of China strategically, not economically, but strategically. And to do that, they really need to be able to impact on the policy making of the Southeast Asians. And of course, there are no Southeast Asian members, and the Southeast Asians don't actually pay much attention to it. I think the other thing about the Quad is that the members all have quite different reasons for being there. India's reasons for membership are not the same as Japan's or the United States or Australia's. India's reason for being there is that India likes to demonstrate its non-alignment by going to the meetings held by all of the groups. So, evidently, India has not taken a position with respect to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, and it won't take a position on that. And yet the United States and Australia have taken very strong positions. So the Quad is kind of sort of slimy-wimey, as Doctor Who might say. It's a bit ambiguous, but I think nonetheless it does have a utility because it does get four pretty significant countries, at least significant to us, together to hold vaguely useful discussions.
Yeah, and the Quad meeting was supposed to be held in Sydney, and we were supposed to get a president from US, President Biden. That fell through at the last minute. That kind of caused a bit of a kerfuffle.
Meant to meet in Sydney, a cancellation from Joe Biden threw a spanner in the works.
The criticism of the postponement of this visit, It's like, well, how do we rely on this joint over there that just can't get its own act together?
So it's embarrassing for the United States, embarrassing for Biden.
Well, it's weird.
But it was for very obvious domestic political reasons. Has it really caused a problem, or is it a bit of a storm in a teacup?
Look, there was a lot of excitement about President Biden's decision to cancel, but honestly, if President Biden had not cancelled, he would have been pilloried in the United States. The US has got a very, very big economic problem that it's got to solve if it's to remain solvent.
Republicans.
You're not kidding. You're not kidding. I mean, he would have been pilloried not only by the Republicans for not being on the job, but it would have been pilloried by his own party. He had to go back to the US. But I don't think there's been any loss to Prime Minister Albanese from that. And when the Prime Minister met up with President Biden in Japan, he said, look, I would have had to do the same thing. So I think ultimately good sense prevailed and the excitement levels went down.
Yeah. And of course, for listeners, that we are, of course, referring to the Republicans refusing to pass raising of the debt ceiling in the United States.
US could default if Congress does not agree to raise the debt ceiling.
Dealing with the debt ceiling and making sure that we lift it in a timely manner is the number one priority for us domestically right now. And the timeline has gotten really short.
Yes, it's looking like doomsday is June 1st.
But instead we have another Quad member, another Quad leader visiting Australia. That's Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
One of the big four, though, is still making the trip for a sellout event at Olympic Park.
And the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi!
What's the significance of that trip? We have seen footage that he was welcomed by some pretty big crowds in Sydney.
Prime Minister Modi is the boss!
But how important is that relationship, and how important is this visit?
Look, our relationship with India is a long-standing one, and in my view, it is an important relationship to Australia. It has never delivered what many of us have hoped for from that relationship, going back really to the early post-Second World War years. Now, there are good reasons for that. A lot of it has to do with the nature of India itself, a very structured, a socially structured country. A lot of it has to do with the nature of Indian policy, which has long been inward-looking and protectionist. Very hard for India over a long period to really engage effectively with the international trading system and international financial system. All of that's been moving. And you can't sort of look past a country which within a decade will be the most populous country in the world, but also one of the youngest countries in the world. And that's very significant for Australia. We've already got a large Indian community in Australia, and it is growing by the week. And a lot of those young Indians will migrate to Australia. It will be a critical source of skills and labour for the Australian economy for the long-distant future. So it is a really significant relationship, and we've got to see it that way.
I guess I'm just really struck by the difference in the way perhaps the Australian media or the polity treats China and some of its domestic problems and human rights abuses compared to India and some of its domestic problems and human rights abuses. We hear a lot about human rights issues in China, but there's been some quite awful violence in India against the Muslim community and others. And I feel like we don't tend to hear as much about that. It's not really as much of a focus. So I know we're not experts in either, Alan, but does that jump out at you as well? Like, why does India get a pass and China is always in the hot seat?
Well, it's because we don't like to criticise our friends and we love to pour it on our putative enemies. We're pretty liberal in handing out criticism of China, whether it's for the way in which China deals with its own population, surveillance particularly, and how it might deal with some of its own minorities, the Uyghurs being a terrific example. We were highly critical of how the Chinese government in Beijing dealt with Hong Kong, for example.
And rightly so.
And rightly so. We're not anything like so critical when it comes to our friends. I don't know when any Australian media outlet last talked about the fact that there are still, I think, 31 states of the United States Union that hang people. Or execute them in other ways. We don't really talk much about the civil unrest in India, the effective oppression of Muslim communities and Sikh communities in India, the ongoing problems over Kashmir, for example, the problems on the border with Jammu. These are not brought to public attention in Australia because India is a member of the Commonwealth and it's a friend of ours. We play cricket there, we like curry, and the Commonwealth plays in all the time. But I'd like to suggest that India is much, much more important than cricket, curry and Commonwealth, not only for the reason that many, many young Indians are coming here and are making us a bigger, brighter and better country, but also because India itself has a capacity to make enormous contributions to the way in which the world will operate itself through the course of the rest of this century. We should be working with them now, including on rights, but not in a stentorian way, not with the megaphone, but talking quietly to whoever the Prime Minister happens to be, Modi now or a future Prime Minister, on the fact that it would be much better for everybody if India could have a somewhat gentler, more accommodating, inclusive approach to religious difference, for example, as well as to ethnic difference and political difference.
It's been a speedy visit to Sydney, but a substantial one for India's Prime Minister. Narendra Modi today signing off on new deals with Anthony Albanese, including a migration and mobility agreement, making it easier to travel between the two countries.
Why has the Biden administration been so reluctant to criticize Modi's government on human rights? What will it take? How much does the Modi administration have to criminalize the act of being Muslim in India for us to say something?
It's high time that Narendra Modi is challenged on the breakings of these UN conventions and on the reports of human rights abuses in Kashmir.
Yeah, certainly. A lot of the time Australia doesn't have a leg to stand on, just looking at some of the awful discourse around The Voice at the moment. Indeed. We've obviously got our own problems as well. I now want to move on to AUKUS. AUKUS is kind of a long-term thing for a long-term relationship with both the United States and the UK, and it's kind of a bit bigger picture. We've seen, I think, a few more questions be raised recently about this agreement. What does it mean? How does it actually help us? And the Australia Institute recently published an open letter from a number of prominent Australians who are asking for a bit of an inquiry. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes, we published a letter which stretched right across the Australian political spectrum. It wasn't a party political, it wasn't sort of a deeply leftist kind of letter. It was a letter which simply asked that the Parliament be allowed to do its job, which is to have a public parliamentary inquiry into what AUKUS is all about. Honestly, Eb, I don't know what AUKUS is all about. I know that it's going to deliver perhaps 3 old nuclear-powered submarines from the United States sometime, with the possibility sometime of getting 2 more, and that after we've got those, we will join with the British and sometime design an Australian-British submarine, nuclear-powered submarine, which we will build sometime and may sometime be delivered. Well, I just don't think it's good enough.
Sounds a bit vague, Alan.
Well, a little bit vague anyway. When everything is out there in the future, it's sometime, but we don't know when, we really don't know where or how or even why. So all we were asking for is that there be a measure of proper accountability on something which is so huge, not just in expenditure. And in expenditure terms, we're talking, according to the Parliamentary Budget Office, over $500 billion. And for anybody who's been around the defence field, you get the first price, multiply by 3.
Yeah.
So we're talking about well over $1 trillion worth of investment in a new capability. Why?
Yeah.
And I think that we need answers to that. It may be a good idea, but I think it needs to be demonstrated.
Early in the next decade, Australia will take delivery of 3 US Virginia-class nuclear-powered submarines.
Both countries see AUKUS as being about security and jobs.
Have been criticised by China and Russia, who say the vessels risk sparking a nuclear arms race in the Indo-Pacific.
I think the AUKUS itself is not a good idea itself, and the nuclear submarine is even the bad word, a worse one.
It's not the only open letter we've seen recently. I know you and the Australia Institute signed another open letter, this one from academics. What were the nature of their concerns in that open letter?
Exactly the same concerns as we touched upon very briefly. It's a much longer letter, goes into a bit more detail, and of course many, many more people from right across the university spectrum in Australia. Very, very eminent, sensible academics who really do know what they're talking about. A number of them are public commentators, but many more of them are out there teaching.
Yeah.
It really is another source of, it's another source revealing concern. And when you've got people deeply engaged in the way in which Australia works with other countries in international relationships, or deeply engaged with security policy, particularly defence policy, when they're all clubbing together and coming out and saying, hey, look, there's a lot more we need to know about this. We teach the subject and we don't know why we're teaching this.
Yeah.
And that's really what they're trying to say, for really come out and make sure that all of us understand what we're letting ourselves in for.
And obviously it was pretty recently that Paul Keating came out very strongly with concerns about AUKUS.
A 4,000-tonne boat like the Collins worked perfectly around the Australian coast because it was designed to protect Australia. It wasn't designed to sit off the Chinese coast sinking Chinese submarines. The Chinese can also shoot our submarines because we're in the shallow water and we are detectable. We could have 50 Collins-class boats and 15 at sea, and we'd have a much stronger defence than this rubbish that the government's doing.
Who are some of the prominent Australians who signed on to the Australia Institute's open letter?
We've got people who were formerly cabinet ministers in the Rudd and Gillard governments. So we had people from the Labor side. We had Peter Garrett, Carmen Lawrence, and Melissa Park, who was our development minister when she was in Parliament. Then we also asked two very prominent crossbenchers who worked with Julia Gillard to substantiate her government in Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott. They had originally been from the National Party, but had become independents in due course. We asked a leading Western Australian, Janet Holmes à Court, and she also signed the letter. And I think all of this is indicative of the fact that in Western Australia, that will be one of the submarine bases. And that's why there's a high level of Western Australian interest. And then the Secretary of the South Coast Labor Council, Arthur Rorris, because Wollongong is also suggested as one of the submarine bases, there's a lot of interest there too. So these people all came together along with a couple of other academics and signed a letter suggesting that the Parliament should be able to do its job.
And it seems like quite a straightforward proposition, I would think, Alan, given we are about to spend half a trillion, was it?
Well, minimum.
$500 billion minimum.
Doesn't it roll off the tongue?
Yeah, right.
So easy.
Surely an inquiry would be the least of the things the Parliament could look into.
Yes, but we all know that the politics of the moment often cut across the decision to have parliamentary inquiries. The basic rule of thumb for any government is never have an inquiry where you don't know what the answer is before you ever have the inquiry. But in this case, we're talking about something which is so significant, so enduring and so long-term that without an inquiry, simply the electors, the voters, don't know what they're signing on to.
Yeah.
And as I say, the purpose of our letter and the letter of the academics is not to sink the project. The purpose is to find out what on earth it's about. And then we may have to sink it, but we need the facts first.
And just before we wrap up, I wonder if I could kind of bring you back to the bigger picture. We have seen in some other moves recently that China is relaxing some of its trade restrictions against Australia. We've obviously got all this colour and movement with AUKUS and the Quad. How is Australia and this new government travelling in terms of our international relationships at the moment?
Look, I think the government is travelling pretty well. They had a fair bit of catching up to do, I think. Our immediate region, particularly the Southwest Pacific, but also Southeast Asia, had been largely overlooked. And I think the government has moved quite quickly to re-establish at least an image of interest and wish for access to Asia more broadly. And I think that's been going pretty well. The tone of the conversations has been exactly the sort of tone that you would hope for: measured, deliberate, professional, sensitive. I think that the way in which the Prime Minister has been dealing with his counterparts in Asia, the Prime Minister of Japan, certainly in Indonesia, his meeting with President Xi, these have been properly managed, no hysteria, no megaphone. I think these are important signals to everybody that Australia's back in business as a contributor to prosperity and harmony, not as a critique of any single player in the way in which the distribution of power works in Asia. I think that is continuing. You will note that some people think that it's not a good idea for the Prime Minister to visit China until all of the trade deals have been fixed. In other words, to impose conditionality on the Prime Minister's visit. Frankly, I think that's a really stupid way of trying to think about what Prime Ministers do. Prime Ministers actually can go to China to fix things. So you don't make it a condition on the Prime Minister's freedom to have officials fix things before the Prime Minister goes and has a chat. You know, it's the sort of thing that is amateur hour. And I think it's always much better when there are problems for the high-level leadership of countries to be able to come together and to thrash it out at their level rather than simply have to come along as though there's some kind of almond icing going on top of a fruitcake. And that, frankly, is no way in which I can see foreign policy.
One last thing, Peter Dutton's speech where he focused on the limits of diplomacy and I think struck a much more different tone than we hear from the government, certainly. Do you have any observations on that?
Look, I think it would be important for the opposition, and I thought I heard the shadow foreign affairs spokesman, Simon Birmingham, on Sunday, making sort of much more sense than delimiting the scope of diplomacy, of narrowing diplomacy, of making sure that diplomacy can only occur when there are no problems. I thought that what Simon Birmingham was saying, for example, made sense to me. It's the sort of thing I would imagine any other opposition adult would make when talking about where Australia should go. We've been lucky in Australia that between our two major parties, we've seldom had major foreign policy splits, sometimes minor ones. We've generally been pretty bipartisan. And I think bipartisanship is not an end in itself. It comes about when governments announce good policy and oppositions can say, well, that sounds pretty sensible to me. So I think that that's what we need to be looking at. And I mean, I know why the leader of the opposition is talking the way in which he does. He's got to appeal to his own base. But I think that there is a much bigger base that has got to be addressed by the opposition in talking on foreign policy as well as on domestic policy, and The Voice.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thanks so much, Alan.
Thank you very much, Ebony.
This episode was recorded live on Wednesday, the 24th of May, 2023, and things may have changed since recording. If you liked today's episode, please rate and review us. It helps other people to find the show. And if you love the show and want to help us continue to do work with impact and influence, please consider supporting the Australia Institute with a small tax-deductible gift today. You can do that at australiainstitute.org.au, where you'll also find all our latest research and content. We're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a NNT. Alan Beam is at Miranda Process. That's MIRANDAPRORSUS. Our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.